10 millimeter automatic. It's a good caliber. Is it ever a better choice than, say, 9 millimeter or some other calibers? That's what we're going to talk about today on Gunfighter Life. Welcome to the podcast where we tackle this topic and, God willing, many more the right way with God Almighty at the center, biblical Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. I am blessed to serve you as host, military, law enforcement, private security, contracting, competition shooting, and some other stuff in the background. Bio bullet points in the show notes. First and foremost, I'm a Christian. I say that because without God, I couldn't have done any of those things. And now I try and take those blessings and that experience and pass knowledge on to you guys. That said, today's episode, caliber stuff always gets people worked up. Not everybody all the time, but some people some of the times, right? So some of this is going to be actual like math and knowledge. Some of it's going to be my opinion. So, you know, if it's my opinion, obviously you can disagree with that or whatever, but let's get into it. Let's start off, and I've talked about 10 millimeter before, but let's start off with a basic layout of the 10 millimeter. To give you guys some rough history and knowledge, you give credit where it's due, I'm going to cite Wikipedia. It says, introduced in 1983. N.R.A, Sweden of all places, not an American round, Swedish. That's pretty cool. We don't get a lot of, handgun stuff from Sweden. We don't really think of Sweden as a handgun kind of thing, but here we go, N.R.A. It's, of course, 10 millimeter or 40 caliber, which is one whole millimeter more than 9 millimeter, right? And we got some loads listed here. We got a federal loading listed on Wikipedia, 180 at 1,300. We have an Underwood of 155 at 1,500. Got a Winchester listing of 175, which is kind of an odd grain weight, but whatever. We got a 175 at 1,290. Now, in the 80s, we had the F.B.I. Miami shootout, and the F.B.I. wanted a better caliber, so they started looking at stuff. They had the 10 millimeter, and they shortened it to the 40 Smith & Wesson, which I think is one of the biggest tragedies of modern American firearms. I think the 40 Smith & Wesson is a horrible caliber. It makes no sense ever as far as the way it's implemented. There's nothing wrong with the caliber as far as numbers go, but leave it to like governments and committees to ruin something by trying to shove it in a 9 millimeter sized handgun. Anyway, the point of that, 40 Smith & Wesson is a shorter, weaker version of the 10 millimeter, which was popular for a while, but not so much anymore. Thankfully, the 40 Smith & Wesson is finally dying a slow death. The 10 millimeter, on the other hand, is seeing a bit of a resurgence. I don't have the data in front of me, but I imagine if you look at new manufactured firearms in the past 2 or 3 years, you will find more new firearms being chambered in 10 millimeter than 40 Smith & Wesson, which was not the case, a decade or so ago. So 10 millimeter has seen a bit of a resurgence. I think it always should have been more popular than 40 Smith & Wesson, but that's neither here nor there. The point is it's nowhere near as popular as 9 millimeter. 9 millimeter is the de facto handgun caliber of our time. And I feel a bit vindicated in this because a long time ago, as far as this whole discussion is concerned, I was a big fan of 9 millimeter. Now, I didn't start off that way. I did carry a 9 in the war, bred a 92. I went to work for L.A.P.D. They issued me a 40 Smith & Wesson. And the common knowledge of the time was you had to have a 40 Smith & Wesson or a 45. 9 millimeter just didn't work. That was the common trope of the era. We're talking late 90s, early 2000s. Now, I started getting serious about shooting. I was a big caliber warrior then, even before, this just like big social media thing. This is nothing new. The caliber wars predate this, but I was a big caliber warrior. I was like, 40, I'm going to go to 45, and I did for a long time, carried 45. and I thought I was a decent shooter. I was decent as far as L.A.P.D standards went, pretty decent shooter. And I went to my first pistol competition. I was had already been a pretty accomplished rifle competitor, and I wanted to go to pistol because I thought if I was going to get in a fight for my life, it was most likely going to be with a pistol, so I should start shooting competitions with a pistol. I went to my first pistol competition and got spanked. I realized that for a cop, I was okay, which is pretty bottom of the barrel. That's a pretty lousy standard. Even L.A.P.D, which is one of the best and longest academies in the country, that's still a pretty low bar. So I figured I had better get good with a handgun. So I did a bunch of shooting. Started off my competition shooting with a 45. But this is going to tie in, don't worry. Anyway, I started doing a lot of shooting, and I started looking at actual numbers and doing some actual shooting, and I shot with a 9mm, 40, 45, and I quickly realized no matter what a bunch of people said on the internet or whatever, you could not convince me that the 9mm was not more effective, because you could get much more hits on target, you could practice more, which meant that you were more effective, because the most effective thing of handgun shooting is getting the round where you need it to go, and you can do a lot more practice. Even if you're reloading, which I was a big reloader at the time, at one point I had several progressive presses. I had a lot of presses and a lot of stuff set up. I forget if I had 2 or 3 progressive presses set up at one time, and I was doing a lot of reloading. I quickly realized even reloading, I could shoot probably twice as much or so with a 9mm, or practice twice as much as I could with a 45. And there was no way that you were just going to convince me that, the 40 or the 45 was that much better. So I switched from 45 to 9mm. And again, this was back in the day when everybody knew that 9mm didn't do anything. It was basically worthless. You might as well just, and I was a cop at the time, you might as well just carry a slingshot on your Sam Brown, because a 9mm was just going to bounce off people. That was like the common thing of the day. I was like the only one that I knew of carrying, at least I'm not the only one that I knew of, but there was a very few cops at the time, especially where I was, carrying 9mm. But I voluntarily went to the 9mm. And back when forums were a big thing, and it's still on some of my old login stuff, my name is 9mm Master. Because back in those days, nobody was rocking 9mm. So I feel vindicated on that eventually people opened their eyes, and you can only lie about math for so long before people realize that you're lying. 9mm is a good caliber. It is the de facto handgun caliber of our time. Why? Because it's the best balance. It is the best balance of affordability, shootability, broad availability of firearms and ammunition. That's it. There's nothing super crazy special ballistically about the 9mm. It's enough, and it's affordable, and it lets you practice a lot, and you can get quick follow-up shots. All those things together, and it's well established, right? These rounds are old. The 9mm, the 45, they're 100 years old. So they're well established. You could probably design, if I'm being honest, a better cartridge today than 9mm with modern bullet technology. That would be fine, and maybe even better. But you would have to do so much to get it to have any substantial portion of the market that it really wouldn't probably work. See 30 Super Carry for an example. Look at what that ammo costs and what you can get that ammo for versus 9mm. So with that said, 9mm is the de facto handgun caliber of our day. And I'm going to tell you, the vast majority of the time, for the vast majority of situations, the 9mm is going to be your best choice for EDC, for defense, for carry. The vast, vast majority of the time. However, not all the time. The 10mm is a good caliber. It is more powerful. Now, more is not always better. Sometimes more is worse. Water is very good. You need water to drink to stay alive. But if I put you in a box and flood it with water, you're going to die. There's too much water in that situation. More is not always better. In America, we're always, not always, but a lot of times we're like, oh, bigger, better, supersize me. More is not always better. More calories is not always better. More whatever is not always better. So The 10 millimeter, though, is more. Sometimes more is better. How much more? Well, these are rough numbers from my head, but 9 millimeter, pretty standard loadings. You're looking at 115 grain at 1,200 feet a second. If you talk about a fairly stout NATO load, which is in America kind of like a plus P load, but a NATO load, you're talking at 124 at around 1,200 feet a second. If you talk about 147s, those are generally just under, the sound barrier right around 10, 1050, maybe 980, but right around 1,000 feet a second for 147 grain. Just real quick, just a few examples from that Wikipedia thing I cited earlier, right? The loads for that, we got 175 grain at 1,290. There's 155 grain at 1,500. That is more. That is substantially more. So when, if ever, would the 10 millimeter be a better choice for situation X, Y, or Z? What are some of those situations? Well, handgun hunting is one. I love handgun hunting. I'm a pretty avid handgun hunter. I've taken, honestly, more deer. I've thought about it. I've killed more deer with a handgun and other stuff too than I can honestly remember. I've been very blessed in that. I like it. I like it for the challenge. I like it for the test of the marksmanship ability with a handgun. If you're handgun hunting, the 10 millimeter is a better choice. Big game anyway, like large game, deer and up. 10 millimeter is a better choice than 9 millimeter if that's what your main goal is. Especially if you can pair it and have it. Let's say you generally carry a 1911 or 2011 in 9 millimeter. Well, that's originally a 45 design handgun, so it'll fit a 10 millimeter, which is same overall length basically. It'll fit in the same size frame. You can do that, right? You can have a 1911 9 millimeter as your carry gun, and you could have a 10 millimeter if you want to go out and handgun hunt. And other than your follow-up shots being slower and more recoil, which I'd say is a disadvantage in defensive scenarios, you're not doing double taps in hunting. So that's a moot point. So if you want to keep the same ergonomics, the same manual of arms, the same everything and hunt with a more powerful cartridge, there you go. That's an example of when 10 millimeter would be a better choice. You have your gun set up the same way, sights the same way, sighted in the same. Maybe you got some good hard cast, 10 millimeter bullets. It's a decent hunting option. Let's go to the complete opposite end of like urban stuff. Let's say you generally carry a 9 millimeter because it's a better choice generally. But let's say in your vehicle or in your work rig, like let's say you generally work in a crew and you can't just have a long gun. I'm a big fan of having a truck gun, a long gun in your truck, one or two, like a shotgun and a rifle. I have those in my truck right now. I'm a big fan of that, having proper, like full powered firearms. But maybe you can't. Maybe you're relegated to like a PDW or PCC or even a larger handgun. Like let's say, you can't carry something on you that's this big, but you could carry like an FN in 10 millimeter, a much larger handgun in the center console of your vehicle, and lock it up, and nobody's going to be the wiser. And that's maybe a better option if the peanut butter and chocolate hits the fan and you have to make it home, and that's all that you have. Yeah, in that situation, 10 millimeter may be better. Also, for a vehicle gun, one thing you may have to deal with is other vehicles, stopping other vehicles, vehicle rammings, things like that. That's a thing. Now, I don't think it's better for anti-personnel stuff, but for anti-equipment stuff, like stopping a vehicle, 10 millimeter is going to be a better choice for that. So that would be another example of when 10 millimeter is better. Here's a real niche one, but there's only one jurisdiction like this that I'm aware of where they actually want you to hurt more people or really be negligent. But New Jersey, no surprise, right? New Jersey, I think, has a law where even if you have a carry permit, which is probably hard to get in New Jersey, I don't know, I try to stay out of that place, but anyway, New Jersey has a law, I believe still, that you are not allowed to carry hollow points. You peasant are not allowed to carry hollow points. They are for, government agents to kill people. You cannot You cannot do that. You can't carry hollow points in New Jersey. So 9mm, how it relates to this discussion, 9mm is a pretty effective, as far as handguns go, fighting handgun caliber with modern expanding projectiles. If I cannot have those projectiles, something else, something that would do a little bit better with a full metal jacket or a hard cast truncated cone Keith wad cutter, if it feeds, type of deal, that may be a better option. So if New Jersey, 45 auto, or for today's discussion a 10mm, and they probably have a magazine restriction, right? So it's not like you're going to give up a lot there because you're probably limited to 10 rounds anyway. So if you're only going to have 10 rounds and they can't be expanding hollow point ammunition, you had to carry full metal jackets. I like 9mm. I don't like 9mm FMJ for defense. So in that small niche scenario, with all those caveats in place, government imposed, malum prohibitum, then 10mm makes more sense there in that situation. If you forget about the ammo cost and practice cost, but how much practice are you doing in New Jersey? So not only are you probably less well trained and less well regulated, you're probably more restricted and have worse ammo and are more likely to run into issues. But anyway, that's New Jersey. So those are some situations where 10mm might make more sense than 9mm. Again, the vast majority of the time, 9mm is going to be your better option. That's why it has become the de facto, fighting handgun caliber of our day and around the world. Just popped up a search on Midway USA. They're not a sponsor. I just used them, so I like to be honest about that. And I put in 10mm ammo. It came up with 133 results. Now, likely they're not all in stock right now, but again, 10mm has seen quite a resurgence. If you'd have looked at ammo availability in that caliber, 15 years ago, it would not have been, I don't think, as plentiful. Let's look at some cool loads here, shall we? Underwood, not sponsored by any of these companies, but Underwood, 10mm, 220 grain, flat nose, hard cast. We talked about a similar ammo earlier, right? 220 grain at 1,200 feet per second. HSM makes a bear load, 200 grains. Let's look here. We got 200 grains at a little over 1,000 feet a second. Let's go to Buffalo Bore. What do they got? They got a 220 grain flat nose as well. And here we're looking at 220 grains at 1,200 feet a second. Pretty similar to that first load we talked about. 703 foot-pounds. I didn't talk a lot about foot-pounds in the beginning, but 703. That's more than 9mm. Generally, 9mm is right around 400 foot-pounds. Just under or just over. Right, a fairly vanilla 9mm load is going to be under 400, and a hot 9mm load is going to break 400 foot-pounds. This is 700. That's significantly more. Now, there's no free lunch. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Most other things being equal, you're going to get a lot more recoil, which means slower shot recovery time. So you're going to get less shots on target in a given amount of time. I don't care how big and bad you are, how good you control recoil. If you reduce it, you can shoot faster. That's how it works. That's how physics works. So again, not the standard, but sometimes you might want to make that trade-off. Let's revisit the cost thing here. I'm going to use AmmoSeek. It's a good place to look. It's like a search engine like you would use Expedia or Travelocity for travel. You use AmmoSeek if you're serious about buying ammo in bulk. Currently, looking at this, AmmoSeek, at the time of this recording, who knows what ammo will cost when you listen to this, but we see some 9mm, cheapest I can see on here is 6.5 cents a round. And there's quite a bit of it going up to 13, 14, a lot in the 14, 15 cents a round in 9mm. That one that's 6.5 is kind of an anomaly. Most of it's 13, 14, 15 is your cheaper end of 9mm cents a round. Now for 10mm, 33 cents a round, and there's quite a bit of it in the 33 cent range. which is pretty interesting, right? I said even years ago when I was comparing it to 45, about double. And that's about what we see here with 10 millimeter. We've seen a resurgence. It's a lot more available than it used to be, but it's still double or more than 9 millimeter. When you get serious about shooting and you start buying ammo by the case instead of by the box, it tells me that you're a more serious shooter, or reloading by like the case instead of the box, right? That tells me you're a pretty serious shooter. It's hard for me to believe that for most situations you wouldn't be better off with a 9 millimeter that you train with twice as much. Let's say your ammo budget is $200 a month, right? You have $200 a month allocated every month for ammo. You're going to be able to buy whatever the count is. You're going to be able to buy twice as much in general 9 millimeter as 10 millimeter or 45 or whatever. So again, generally 9 millimeter better. But if you have a similar handgun setup and you do a bunch of training with a 9 and you know you're going to be slower, less controllable with a 10, but you want to make that trade-off in recoil, you can. And a lot of people are going to compare the 10 millimeter to revolver cartridges. And it's probably, a lot of times it gets compared to 44 Magnum. I don't think that's fair. 44 Magnum is way more powerful than 10 millimeter. It just is. And it's probably most analogous to a 41 Magnum, but that caliber is largely forgotten. Almost nobody's rocking a 41 Magnum. It's probably more comparable to 357. It's kind of apples and oranges because when you got a smaller bullet, but it's in there. It's not called a Magnum, but 10 millimeter is kind of a Magnum cartridge. The big difference between those is obviously the platform, a revolver versus a semi-auto. They both have their advantages and disadvantages. This is not the episode for that. But obviously, a semi-auto has its advantages in a lot of areas. So if you want a more powerful semi-auto for whatever situation, X, Y, or Z, one of the ones we discussed or one of the ones that I forgot about or didn't think of, 10 millimeter is kind of it, right? As far as popular actual Magnum calibers go. No, don't consider 40 Smith & Wesson. Throw it in the trash where it belongs, is my opinion. But as somebody that's done a lot of shooting with a 40 Smith & Wesson, had to carry one on duty for a long time, that is, again, one of the worst tragedies on modern American, gun scene in the past 100 years. Because generally they shove it in a 9 millimeter size gun, which is horrible. If you put it in a proper gun like a STI Edge, it's a decent caliber. But that's generally not what people are doing. Anyway, if you want a big, powerful handgun caliber and a semi-auto, 10 millimeter is really it, right? Yeah, there's the 9x25 Dillon, largely a wildcatter's proposition. There's, the 357 SIG, which I like, but is fallen by the wayside. I don't know that anybody chambers a new gun in 357 SIG. So if you want a powerful semi-auto handgun cartridge, 10 millimeter is kind of it. Again, to reiterate for the who knows how many times, in general, 9 millimeter is your better choice. But sometimes you may want a 10 millimeter. I hope that this discussion was helpful. With that, your tactical tip of the day, I often harp on carry a full-size fighting handgun on your hip like a man, not one of these little #MeToo baby guns pointed at your genitals. I harp on that all the time. But today we're talking about 10 millimeters. Those in general are going to be bigger, heavier guns. A good, proper belt is always important. But, don't go spending all the money on a nice gun, Gucci ammo and all this stuff and get a chintzy belt. It's kind of like if we want to use a rifle analogy, it'd be like getting a really nice rifle and a really nice optic and getting a dirt cheap garbage, Chinese, not made properly scope mounts. That's your weak link. Once that falls apart, the other stuff doesn't really matter. Don't chintz out on your belt when it comes to, concealed carry, especially if you're going to carry a large gun, like a 10 millimeter generally is. So get a good belt. And I don't care if you're more of the, nylon, ballistic nylon webbing kind of guy, or you're more the, old school buffalo hide, leather kind of guy. Both those guys are welcome here. There's good quality concealed carry belts in both of those. But get a good quality, stiff, rigid, rugged belt. Don't skimp out on the belt. How about a tactical verse of the day, shall we? Your tactical verse of the day. But I fear, lest somehow, as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, so your minds may be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ. My thoughts. There's a lot of deception out there. There's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of things trying to pull us away from God in culture, in society. That's nothing new. Satan was doing that back in the garden. Don't be corrupted from the simplicity that is the gospel, the simplicity that is in Christ. With that, thanks for listening and have a blessed day.